Great, thank you. Well, I appreciate everybody attending our presentation on effective email communication today. The subject of this is going to be, how do we use email in a professional environment? How does that differ from email in a personal environment? That kind of thing. And I'm going to throw in some tips and tricks here and there as we go through it. So we'll get started first with the agenda. Some of the topics are the important things to consider when you're getting ready to, or when you're going through the process of trying to do any kind of communication. What's the purpose, the audience, the conciseness, accuracy, clarity, courtesy, confidentiality, the structure, how you're going to put it together, and then, making all that effectively work well together. So we'll jump right in. In general, the purpose of what we're doing in business is communication. We have to communicate with one another. There's several different ways to communicate. There's directions to communicate. We communicate up to our bosses and down to our subordinates and side to side with our peers, inside the company, outside the company. All of these different types of communication have nuances that we have to consider when we're going to communicate effectively. Do you guys have a preferred way of communicating? I think email is probably one of my favorite ways to communicate because it allows me to take time and put information in a format that I can check through several times and make sure that I've been clear in what I've said. What about you guys? Do you have preferences?
Mine's face to face, in front of that person, or video call. Anything other than that, and I just don't like it. I like to be able to see their reaction. I like to be able to watch their eyes, their movements, because to me that speaks more than just somebody's words or an email.
Absolutely, those nonverbal cues.
I have to agree with Rich because I think that when you're talking, whether it be on the phone, but preferred face-to-face or even video, you can see a lot of the nuances and a lot of things you can't really tell through text. Sarcasm being one of them. The tone of the conversation, I think, is a lot more prevalent when you're doing something like that versus just text or email.
Text and emails, sometimes you get, I'll tell you, there's a lot of times that they can be misconstrued and taken in a negative or a positive way when they're not supposed to be meant that way. Most of the time when I receive a text or an email from someone, I don't necessarily understand the context that it's in. So that's one of the reasons why I hate those forms of communication. It can absolutely be misunderstood.
That's one thing we bring up later is tone and that kind of thing, how that can affect communication. Personally, with, what I do, I like to have the paper trail because it gets down to he said, she said, and, I don't have any, unless I've recorded it, that I don't have any good way of having that paper trail. We'll cover that as well. So moving right along, in general, in a recent survey of business professionals, 65% preferred email for a lot of different reasons. Some of those reasons were it's fast, I can fire off an email, sometimes too quick. Sometimes you have to stop and think about, should I really be sending this? It's cheap, it's easy to use, it's convenient. One thing I like about email is I can respond to it kind of as I have time to give it the proper amount of attention that it deserves, rather than, if you just call me out of the blue and I got 10 balls in the air and, I can't really put 100% focus on something, then it's harder for me to give you a valid answer than it would be if, I could work on my own schedule there. Focus, with email, I can reread email until I fully digest it. You don't always have that kind of capability with other forms of communication. The paper trail, like I mentioned earlier, the reference trail, digital, it saves paper, so you can be, environmentally helpful there. And in general, it expands a business's capability to communicate with their customers. One of the first things we need to do when we do any kind of communication is figure out what our purpose is. So, why are you writing email in the first place? Are you announcing something? Are you informing? Are you asking a question? Do you want to discuss something? Or, is there some kind of response that you're trying to elicit? What's the goal? And then also you need to consider, is email the most appropriate form of communication? Like we just discussed, there may be reasons that you don't want to have this conversation via email. We'll go through some of those as we move forward. Also, what are your expectations when you send that email? I've kind of laid out some of the possible responses to a sent email. So, I could be sending it out with no reply intended. I want to tell somebody something, I want to pass along some information. It's just no reply required. Sometimes you want information back and you're actually sending an inquiry type email. Like advice or questions, and some type of response is your desired outcome. There's an open-ended email that could go, either way. It's like a conversation, like a natural conversation back and forth. Sometimes it won't be the first email in the chain. It'll be the one that, where you're just conversing back and forth via email. And then there's an action email. Sales folks would send this out. I need that SOW sign. I need that commitment. I need whatever, and you expect action to be taken there. So that's some different kinds of purposes that you might have when sending email. One of the most important things that you need to consider is who's your audience? Who are you sending this email to? What is their perspective? What is their knowledge and experience? I bolded this next bullet point here because it's something that I see a lot in our industry. We deal in acronyms all the time. And especially when we're onboarding new people, or, you're dealing with somebody that you don't know, or you're dealing with somebody outside of the company, it's a really good idea to spell those acronyms out the first time you use them. So if I'm going to use ITIL, I'm going to reference ITIL, for instance, I might type out, the IT, the whole thing, and then I'll put in quotations at the end of it, ITIL, and that way they'll know when I reference it in the further down in the email what that stands for, IT Infrastructure Library. If you're writing for a general audience, you may want to check it against something called a Flesch-Kincaid readability index, especially if you're writing marketing content or something that's going out to the masses and you don't know who it's going to. Most of that type of stuff they recommend writing between 5th and 8th grade level. And the only way you can really determine that is to run it through one of these evaluation tools and see if it meets that grade level. So you're writing, you have to come back sometimes, especially when I write stuff, I write beyond that grade level, and I have to come back and I have to analyze the sentences and figure out what could be too complex. And that's hard sometimes when you're trying to write at a 5th grade level. It's been a while since I've written at a 5th grade level. So I have to run it back through the machine several times, or through the evaluation tool several times to figure out what is it that's offending it. How do I get it down to more simple constructs? You guys ever used that before? Were you aware of it?
I definitely have, without a doubt.
No. Cool. It's good to have access to, especially if you're writing to people that you don't know their education level or their technical level. So the next topic would be conciseness. If you think about it, most people know roughly what they want to say, but they don't necessarily take time to fully flesh it out before they go to writing their email. Imagine, for instance, if I had just, if this PowerPoint here, if I just started with the mass of undefined information that I had in my head about email and just started regurgitating that into a PowerPoint, how it wouldn't have made much sense. There wouldn't be much flow to it. What I did is I brain dumped into a Word document. And then I started playing with all the, started putting things in similar buckets, what groups with something else, what's important, what's not important. So one thing you need to think about as you're putting your email together is, are you clear on what you want to communicate? So make sure that you're clear on what you communicate before you start putting it on paper, and certainly before you hit that send button. Some kind of humorous things, but they really hit home. uh, Winston Churchill once said, a good speech or a good email or a good piece of communication in this case should be like a woman's skirt, long enough to cover the subject and short enough to create interest. These diagrams over here are, this person on the left has something to say, and the person on the right has some amount of interest in it, and where they intersect is the relevant information that is actually important. So you have to, keep all those kinds of things in mind when you're creating any kind of communication. So conciseness is, keep it short. Include enough information for the outcome that you expect, but not so much that people get bogged down in it. One thing to help email move along quicker, have you ever received an email that had a question? I can't think of one off the top of my head, but you ask the question in the email and then you say, if this is true, then let's do this. If not, let's do that. That way, you don't have to have that thrash back and forth where you have to send an additional email. So think about those kinds of things. How can I make it more concise? How can I be more efficient? How can I lay out my emails in such a way that, I can be ahead of those kinds of questions?
Evan, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So with what you just said, it sounds like you mean to say that we shouldn't ask questions anywhere but pretty much at the end when we expect an action item.
No, not necessarily. I don't even think I said where to put it, but when you put a question in your email, if you can anticipate the outcome, go ahead and anticipate the outcome, and that way you saved at least one email back and forth, right? Maybe two emails.
Okay, fair enough.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Cool. We'll get to the ask. I think that's what you're talking about too. The ask is generally at the end of the email, although some people have started putting it in the first line of the email now, and we'll talk about that as we progress through this. Include the ask. What do you want from the email? That's if we back up to the previous slide, that's one of the things here is, what do you want? What's your goal? Have that in mind before you put your email together. Continuing on conciseness, these are more facts, tips, things that came out of my research rather than necessarily useful things. But we answer emails that are the fastest to answer. You guys ever notice that? You're going through your inbox and you cherry pick the emails and you answer the ones that are that are quick and easy, and our natural reaction is to close those long emails, and I'll get back to that later, and how many of you guys actually get back to that? That's one of the things you need to think about too is I didn't have time in 30 minutes to go into like methods of follow-up and how to manage your inbox and things like that. But that's one of the things that you have to consider as a professional is, how am I going to get back to those things that I close, that I don't read? We'll get into some elements of expectations in a few minutes, and how are you going to respond to that? Me personally, I use the to-do list in Outlook quite a bit. Work it constantly, but it's hard to remember how to come back to those emails. I also don't have a zero inbox. A lot of people talk about that zero inbox all the time. I got to have all my emails read in my inbox. I've got 4,000 and something unread emails in my inbox right now because I flip them back over to unread after I've read them because there's some interest. And if I just flip them back to unread, that says there's some interest. I may look at it again. I may never look at it again. If I flip it to unread and I flag it in my outbox for follow-up, then there's an action item or something that I have to do. So there's all kinds of methodologies that you can put into place to help you be more efficient. And if somebody says, you're no good because you don't have a zero inbox, you can tell them I said they're not smart. All right, moving right along. Accuracy is a huge deal. If you want to look like an idiot in business, don't proofread your emails. Make spelling and grammar mistakes in every email you spend, and in every email that you write, and see how quickly you move up through the organization. So, absolutely paramount to write accurately in your emails. You want people to have a good impression of not only you, but of the company, because you represent the company. When you start sending these professional emails, if they're, if they're spelling grammar mistakes all through it, then our customers say, who are these guys hiring? Are these really the experts that we thought they were when we started doing business with them? So, it's good for you. It's good for the company to be accurate. I've got a minor in English, and one of the things that I learned from that experience was to proofread backwards. If you've got a document, it's really easy to read through it from the top down, and there's this concept called closure. You make the sentences say what you think they should say, even if they don't say that, because your mind's just kind of falling through the process of reading it. If you'll flip it over backwards and you'll read from the last sentence first, it makes no sense. There's no natural next step there. So your mind doesn't follow. Your mind doesn't get lazy there. It has to process. So you read the last sentence, and then the next to the last sentence, and then the next to the last sentence. And that way you're looking at everything as an individual sentence. It slows the process down a little bit, but it makes for a lot more accurate proofread. Just a tip. Clarity. Clarity is what it's all about, right? If you're not clear, then what's the point of writing the email in the first place? There was a Steve Jobs, James Murdoch email that got kind of famous for a while. It went around. It was just I'd hate to be James Murdoch, because it was the perfect example of a poorly written email. And it came out during a lawsuit, and you'll see it all over the place when people talk about emails and how to write concisely and all that. And I couldn't find the example that I was looking for where Steve Jobs went into bullet points and all of that kind of stuff, but I got the major part of it here. So if you guys take a minute to read this email, this portion of email that this James Murdoch wrote, and tell me if you can tell me what it's about. So what's he asking?
Please let me know.
Well, let me know what.
He's asking if that they could withstand the percentage of the releases there within the certain pricing structure.
Okay. Anything else?
And if it'd be okay if a supplier were to go outside of them.
Okay. But that was really hard to get to, right? I mean, could he have done a better job?
If I weren't reading it with what you said, to kind of read it closely and to actually pay attention to what I'm reading, it would have been very difficult too. But because I knew that was kind of your point, I read a lot more carefully and thought about it a lot more.
Mm-hmm. And Steve's response to it was, he didn't answer any of the questions. Really, he just came back to it with a straight up real world answer. I took this email apart a little bit in subsequent slides, but have a concise. A lot of people say a single purpose in an email. I won't necessarily say you have to have a single purpose, because you may have multiple questions, and if you ask it in the right way, then your person that's reading the email should be able to track with you. But he really only had 2 points. Like Matt said, if greater than 50% of releases are priced at greater than or equal to $14.99, is that acceptable? And are suppliers authorized to exploit other avenues? He could have bullet pointed those in his email, and Steve could have answered that really concisely. Keep the design simple. Bullet points definitely would have helped in this case. I'm a big fan of bullet points. If you correspond with me on a regular basis, I'll introduce something, I'll break it out into its action points, and I'll summarize it at the bottom. That's just, the eye follows that so easy. The bullet points call out what you need to do. When you hit the last one, you're done. It just makes it really easy to follow an email that way. And all those.
Sorry, Evans. What is your theory on bullet points? I've heard some people say keep it at 3 to 4 bullet points. Do you have a theory or a opinion on that?
It's a feel more than anything else. If you've got 23 bullet points there, it's probably not effective. How many bullet points are effective in what you're doing? I don't know. It depends on the type of data being represented, and I think it's a feel more than anything else. Is it excessive? Is it not excessive? I don't know. I'd have to almost look at that on a case by case basis. Remove those filler words. If you shouldn't muse while you're writing. If you're still coming up with what you want to ask, if you're still soft on what it is that you're trying to communicate, don't put that in your email. Don't keep going around in circles in your email. Decide what you want to say and say it concisely. Remove any ambiguity and don't ramble. And I mean, this guy was just all over the place. If you look at his email, there's all kinds of extra words in there. And I've heard it said that the person that's not confident or the person that's not educated is the one that rambles all over the place in the email. So you're working with somebody there that maybe you need to not even work with the first person in the first place. Maybe they're not the effective person. Maybe you need to find out who the person who knows what's going on is. This guy was obviously just all over the place. Use the active voice. You guys, I'm sure you've heard that. It's probably beating a dead horse, but if you're writing in a passive voice, it makes you sound like you're not committed to something. It makes you sound like you're not as truthful as you could be. It's wishy-washy. It's lukewarm. It's it's not something that professionals like to hear. I like yay or nay. I don't like hearing you've sat there and vacillate in your email, go back and forth between 2 points. Pick a point and go with it. Like here in the example from Murdoch, we would like to be able to get something done with Apple, but they're legitimate. In short, we'd like to get something done. Why do we need in short? He's already not short. He's already too long in his email. He's rambling all over the place. We'd like to be able to get something done with Apple. Okay, that's kind of a given, but there are legitimate concerns, of course. Using the active voice would have made it really clear. We want to work with Apple, but there's legitimate concerns. Nail it down. And look at your sentence. If it feels like it's going on forever, then maybe you should take another run at that and reword it. If it's got 14 commas in it, you probably need to break it into multiple sentences. If it feels like a run-on, feels like it goes on forever, maybe you break it into more concise chunks of info so that people can consume those better. Most rules have exceptions. This one does not. Use that active voice all the time. And I'm not going to read this to you down here, but this was kind of humorous from a literary perspective. Somebody like Stephen King, he has a strong opinion on the topic, and he gives a couple of examples there. And imagine Stephen King, everybody's throwing him their writing. Read this. Am I the next big author? And he looks at that trite, that they write and has to give feedback on it. So, just don't use words just for the heck of it. Don't use words because you think using a lot of words makes you seem smarter or more educated or whatever. Use words because you need them to communicate. And if you, don't use too much. Use what you need to communicate, and that should be enough. Clarity, close with your request. In marketing campaigns, as Rich and team know, you close with your call to action. You close with what you want that person to leave your message with, the next thought, the next action on their mind. You're, in computer terms, you're putting that on the top of their stack. That's the next action for them to do. If the request is embedded in the middle of the email, then you can get distracted by whatever you write after that. It might not be the last thing. In business today, that's the trouble, is you're responding to so many streams of data all the time. If I lose focus for a half a minute, then I'm off and running and I've dropped that email. If I didn't flag it or something, then it might go unanswered. So make sure that you give your reader as much opportunity as possible for that to be the last thought on their head, whatever you're asking them. Something new is in my research, I found that they're calling for the action, the ask, the point of the email to go in the first sentence. I'm not a big fan of that, and I personally, it wouldn't work at all for me. I'm going to forget that. If you choose to use that first sentence approach, then just reiterate what your action is, what your call to action is, what your ask is, whatever your goal of the email was. Remember to reiterate it on your way out, so it is the last thing on their head. I just thought this was funny, so I thought I would share it with you. So sometimes conciseness can go too far, but I guess it depends on that attachment too. Any questions on conciseness? Any discussion? All right. So the next thing's courtesy. When you're writing emails, there's a lot of elements of courtesy in any kind of communication, really, but certainly in a timely response. So what is a timely response? The consensus of opinion out on the internet was to respond promptly to serious messages within 24 hours. So there's, words that need to be interpreted there. What does promptly mean? What is a serious message? That's up to you, and it depends on your role. But, try to get back to your email within 24 hours. I would say in a business environment that it's even shorter than that, and that it depends on the type of email as well. So, be reasonable, but certainly within 24 hours. If you need more than 24 hours to collect information or to make a decision, then send a note to explain why you haven't responded to the email. Sometimes I'll receive an email that's heavy, that's going to take some thought. It's going to take some research. It's going to take, getting information that I don't have today. And because I don't have it, it might be in other people's hands, and I have to send emails to them or go track them down and get info. And I can't necessarily meet that 24-hour response. I'll always respond back and say, I got to gather information. I'll be back to you as soon as I can. Don't expect or demand an immediate response, because generally, it's just not responded to. I think this is more an outside type thing. When we were talking about the different directions of communication, if we're going outside of the company, you certainly wouldn't want to make demands like that usually. But I think there are things in business that are an exception to this rule. There are times when you want to put important. There are times when you want to put, response, immediate response needed, or ASAP, or something like that. So even though these things are good rules of thumb, I think there's exceptions to those rules here and there. If if it goes to your spam filter or whatever, number one, be checking all that stuff. But number two, explain any delays that are caused by electronic transmission, spam filters, etc. With your company email, with your professional email, keep the content professional. If you want to send dancing babies and all that kind of stuff, we can do it with your home email. Do it with your personal email. Obviously it's not professional, and in addition to that, it's a common method for holding some kind of malware payload. So be careful with content that's not professional. And your tone. Remember that direct language can sound harsher via email than in person. So I usually go out of my way to soften up the way I would normally talk in an email to make sure that, I'm not setting myself up for the person to interpret me as being offensive. So, sometimes people say don't put those emoticons and smileys and that kind of stuff in your email. I think inside the company, when you're dealing with people that you deal with every day, and you need to just put that extra little bit of something on there to say, I'm not angry. I'm not aggressive, not trying to be aggressive here or whatever. It's a discussion. Sometimes I think it's okay to do those things. So that's another one of those rules that could go either way inside the company. And depending on your relationship, even outside the company, our project managers probably know our customers better than anybody else. For instance, they work with them every day. They build personal relationships with them. You know, if you've got that kind of relationship with somebody, then maybe you can put an emoticon in your email. Consider how your words could be taken and make sure that you reword things so it's not ambiguous. You know, just read things. How could it be taken? What's the worst case? And then reword your stuff so that the worst case is not that bad. If you receive confusing or unclear email, how do you handle that? You know, always give your writer the benefit of the doubt. And that's in anything, you know, if you think somebody's trying to make you mad or something, give them a phone call. Like Rich said, and Matt said, you know, sometimes it's those nonverbal cues are just missed in email, and just picking up the phone can straighten out a lot of things. Ask politely for clarification and suggest discussing the matter in person. You know, get to some other form of communication if it feels like it's going off the rails. Some emails come in at the end of the last working day of the week, you know, before the holiday. You know, make sure you check and respond to emails just before you leave, and that you're, you know, in line with whatever the expectations are for your role or your job as far as how responsive you are to those emails. But check them before you leave at the end of the day. Confidentiality, that's a huge deal. Email should not be considered a confidential form of communication. Anybody that thinks that email is private, you know, might be named Hillary. Your emails are not private. Avoid talking about other people in a way that you wouldn't want them to hear in an email. Assume everything that you write is a public document, because once those things escape your computer, once you hit send, it's in, you know, it's on the internet. It's out there. It can be obtained in many ways and publicized in many ways. So, you know, make sure that you consider that when you're writing your emails. Everything's public. Structure. I'm not going to get into this too deeply. This is more of a reference section for you guys than it is, you know, something that you absolutely need to know. But go through and read this structure. These are all the different parts of the email, starting from with the to and going through the different CC, BCC, subject line, and what's the normal use of those in a business environment. And it goes through each, you know, attachments, give some tips on finish your email before you put before you fill out the to field, and you'll always have your attachments on the email, things like that. Goes through the greeting, the opening, the body, the closing, signatures. Another tip is at Flycast Partners, all our signatures are created by a service, so you don't have to worry about that. As long as yours is right, then, you know, we're good to go there. And then finally, remember that when you're communicating with people, that they may forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So, you know, work toward that in your emails, that you make both you and Flycast Partners come away so that customer or that person that you communicated with feels better about themselves. Any questions? It's a whole lot of material to go through really quickly. And there's other nuances, other places you could dig in deeper if you wanted to, but I figured that was a good start.
I just want to reiterate something that you touched on earlier, is keeping the emails short throughout marketing, and mostly through my trial and error. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware, we do a lot of A/B testing here at Flycast Partners. We have special tools for that. And through A/B testing and through what I've learned in the industry and talking to other folks in marketing, anything that more than 2 paragraphs, and you pretty much have lost the person that's reading the email. So you need to keep them as brief as you possibly can, and make sure you get your point across in that first 2 paragraphs, because anything after that, and they're probably not going to read much further than that. And if they see a long email, if they open up a long email, I know myself, I have a tendency to skip over it. I do that all the time. Unfortunately, I shouldn't, but it's a fact.
And that's one of those practices that, we could do another presentation on. What do you do when you get an email? How do you how do you manage all that stuff? How do you manage your inbox? And that's one of those, the ways, the methodologies that people use. I cherry pick my emails, boom, knock those out, close those ones that are long, flag them for whatever, flag them for follow-up. I mean, it's just email box management. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys. If you don't have any other questions, I appreciate you guys attending today. If you've got any feedback or any suggestions on how we could improve this presentation, I'd be happy to hear them.